Please join me in welcoming Glenn.
Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. I hope I do Trey and the museum justice with this lecture. So we're going to be talking about religion and spiritualism in the Southeast and Appalachia. Thought it was fitting and spooky enough here to do right at Halloween. So I want to point out, before we get started, this first picture. I don't know how well you can see it, but this is actually a picture from the Foxfire book, Foxfire 7, which, if you're not familiar with what Foxfire is, it's kind of an anthology about Appalachian culture, and it started as a magazine. Journalism students in Raven County gathering information about mountain living, collection of poetry, music, and things like that, and it later turned into just a collection of the ways of life in the mountains. And so I got a good bit of information from the Foxfire books on some of the mountain ways and religion and things of the like. So I just thought this was a cool picture to kind of touch on some of the topics we're going to be talking about. So buckle up. I don't want to overwhelm you, but before I could start talking about spiritualism and religion and the trends that kind of ebbed and flowed in this area, I realized I was going to have to give some context. Sandy, can you read my things in the back? Or is it still a little too tiny? She was getting on to me about my text. So before we can understand how the trends have gone on throughout the years and how they've affected other things, we have to kind of have a context of how religion came to America in the first place. So to begin, 1620, the Puritans arrived in Plymouth, Massachusetts after separating from the Anglican Church. I'm willing to bet that this is probably a year or an era in history that you're all at least somewhat familiar with. Plymouth, Massachusetts is the second permanent colony here in the United States. So the Puritans, sometimes also known as the Pilgrims, come to America and they separate from the Anglican Church from a couple of reasons. So the first reason they separate from the Anglican Church, they see indulgence and opulence in the Anglican Church, and they're really trying to get away from that. And I want to make clear that the Puritans are not reformists. They don't want to work on the Anglican Church from the inside. They want to completely get away from it. So they see indulgence and opulence. The King of England is the head of the Anglican Church. It's the Church of England. And with the King of England being in charge of this church, obviously the wealth that comes along with that is going to be involved in the church. The people that are involved in his court, the people that are involved in the landed gentry are going to be in the church. And so the Puritans are looking at this and they're seeing a lot of pomp and circumstance involved in the church in England because it's obviously very highly tied to the king and the parliament and things like that. And they see that as kind of counterintuitive to some of the things that they're actually reading in scripture. Church shouldn't be about pomp and circumstance and showing up in that way, so they want to separate for that. They also don't see a lot of piety in the Anglican Church, and piety was big for these people, and you're going to hear that word come up a lot. So piety is the idea that church should run through your life. Religion and worship should be something that's present every single day. It's not something you do on Sundays. It's something that should affect everyday actions. You don't just go to church on Sunday and then raise hell on Monday. You know what I'm saying? So they want to create their own separate space. 1620s through the 1730s. More American colonies are established as England seeks access to new natural resources. They're wanting to open up new trade ventures. This is a time where they're competing with Spain, France, Portugal, those kinds of things. And more colonists are coming in seeking improved conditions and wealth. Georgia is the last colony to be established, and the reason I threw that out there is because of the kind of people that establish here in Georgia. So the people that move into Georgia and are eventually going to be settling here in the North Georgia mountains, and the people who eventually settle into the North Carolina mountains and up into Virginia and West Virginia are going to be Scottish, Irish, and the Scots-Irish. And those are three very different things. So I think Scottish and Irish explain themselves. Scots Irish are the people that were from Scotland and then at the king's request go over to Ireland to kind of try to quell some rebellions there for a bit and then adopt some of the Irish beliefs and then eventually come over to America as well. And so all of those cultures mixing are kind of the people that settle into the mountains over these 110 years that you've got going on here. And so of course with them comes all of their culture and their religion. Those people that come over are mainly Presbyterian, Calvinist, and so they're going to share a common religious thread with the people who have settled in New England. And then we get into the 1740s to the 1770s, and this is a really important one because we have the Great Awakening. How many of you are familiar with the Great Awakening? Okay, so for those of you that are not, the Great Awakening was this big religious fervor that swept through New England. And it started in New England in the 1740s, the early 1740s, and eventually trickled down through the middle colonies and into the southern colonies as well. It was characterized by revivalism and a lot of the idea of winning souls and just getting more people involved in religion in the United States and in the or what would become the United States. They're obviously still the colonies at these points. And it arguably sets the stage for modern day evangelism in the United States, or what we think of as revival culture here in the United States today. So moving right along to the 1770s into the 1800s, you have the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution. You see the pattern that's developing. This is the age of Atlantic Revolution, and it's inspired by Enlightenment thinking. So think of your Enlightenment philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Locke, Voltaire, if you've ever had to read Candide, bless your heart, I did too. And so they all come in, and this is when you see us start to establish America as a sovereign nation. All of these revolutions ping off one another, and you see I don't necessarily mention religion at this time, and that's because religion, like you saw in the Great Awakening, takes a back burner. What you see in this era is civil religion, the ideas of democracy and focusing on creating social contracts between people, the idea that all men are created free and equal, and that's establishing republics. So religion, like you saw previously, kind of gets pushed to the back burner for these Enlightenment ideals. And the romantic ideals of religion are left for this time period. But that changes, of course, in the 1800s and the 1850s because trends come back around. They keep moving in loops. In the 1800s to the 1850s, after we establish as our own nation, you see major westward expansion in America. The Louisiana Purchase occurs, and then this expansion starts bringing up questions. What are we going to do with this new land? The South at this point is fairly established in an agricultural economy, and we know that in this agricultural economy we have slavery. And then in the North we have a movement toward industrialism. And so as we're moving out west, we're trying to decide, okay, are we going to allow slavery in these new territories? Because there is a second Great Awakening at this time period, and part of this second Great Awakening is abolition. So this is where you're going to see the splits in churches like the Baptists. The Southern Baptists break off and form their own because the Northern Baptists believe in abolition and not having slavery be a part of their tenets, and the Southern Baptists break off, obviously, because they're like, it's part of our economy. Things like that. This is where you see things like those revivals and the camp-style meetings and the circuit riders, which, when you think about it, really makes sense. Because as people are moving around, moving westward, it makes sense to have circuit riders. People bring the religion to you and set up the tents and the camp-style meetings in this era. And then that brings us to the 1860s through the 1880s, where it gets really important, and where I'm really going to start getting into the meat of spiritualism and religion. The Civil War occurs between 1861 to 1865, and then of course Reconstruction follows with its own set of issues. So, I know that was kind of a whirlwind of American history, but it all kind of sets the stage of how we get to this point. So, spiritualism in the Victorian era. The Victorian era runs from 1837 to 1901, and this era was primed for spiritualism to take hold. And to be clear, when I'm talking about spiritualism, I'm talking about the belief that there is a realm beyond our own, and that we can access and contact that realm. And that there are certain superstitions and some of those like witchy kind of folkloric things that are involved in that. So, the culture of this time, like I said, was really primed for it. They already had a lot of beliefs about death, mourning, the afterlife, including but not limited to mourning clothing and designated mourning periods. This is probably something that you're all somewhat familiar with. So the mourning periods were oftentimes based on your gender and your age. Children weren't necessarily expected to stay in a mourning period as long as adults were. Men weren't expected to stay in mourning as long as women were. Widowed women were expected to be in mourning for a minimum of 2 years after losing their husband. And the first 6 to 8 months of that mourning period, you were expected to have your face veiled. And the clothes would change. So you couldn't wear any bright colors. You weren't supposed to wear your regularly jewelry. Nothing showy. You couldn't wear, feathers or the little hats or anything like that. The clothing was plain. It was gray, black, navy, and it wasn't patterned. They also did things like death photos. I know that's kind of macabre, but it also kind of makes sense. So photos at this time period were really expensive because it often involved putting an exposure on stuff like silver plating. And so a lot of people would simply wait until someone died to have the photo taken, because then they could just include that expense with another big expense like a funeral. And you've seen photos from the Victorian era. They're always all very neutral faced. That's because an exposure for a photo would sometimes take upwards of 3 to 5 minutes to actually take in the Victorian period. And who wants to stand like this for 5 minutes? So it was easier to just sometimes wait until the person was already gone to have the photo made, because you were guaranteed a nice picture when they can't move. And if this is the only picture you're going to have made in your entire life, you want it to be a good picture. And so that was part of it. They also had other death rituals like wakes, and I know we still have modern day wakes, but these were affairs that could sometimes go on for a couple of days. They would literally lay out the body of the deceased loved one on like the dining room table, surrounded by candles and things like that, and have people in the community come see them, the family come see them. They would also cover mirrors in the house. If y'all have ever seen that, they would cover them with cloths. The idea of that was basically they didn't want the soul of the deceased loved one to get confused and get trapped in one of the reflective surfaces or the mirrors. They would open windows so the soul could escape the house because they didn't want it to get trapped. Another thing they would do is they would try to keep keepsakes of these people, and that is what we have up here. So this is a Victorian hair jewelry. So after people had passed away, you didn't necessarily have to have passed away from this, but for this to happen, but oftentimes it was after somebody had passed away, because that's when you had access to a lot of their hair to do something like this. Victorian hair jewelry is when you would take somebody's hair and then literally have it worked into pieces of jewelry. Sometimes it's wearable jewelry like necklaces, bracelets, brooches, and sometimes it's decorative pieces like this. This is a bouquet, and you are more than welcome to come take a look at this afterward. Just obviously don't touch it, but you can take a look at what the note says. But this is made of human and pet hair. And it is a bouquet, and this would have been something displayed in a house, like on a mantle or something like
Is that
that.
from a local family?
I don't know, is this a local family, Sarah?
We're not.
Virginia.
Virginia.
It says on
A
the
local person
bottom.
gave it to us, please.
Yeah, a local person gave it to us. This is from Hattie G. Mosley. So, Mosley family. We do have some in our collection from the local family. I believe we were on the phone with Tina yesterday, and she was talking about some that we have from the Feltons, correct? So Rebecca Felton, we do have some of hers, and that's like a necklace. So that would be something that you would actually wear. Me personally, I don't want to wear anybody else's hair. That's very icky to me, but
But that was part of their mourning period when they wore it as necklace.
yes. They could wear it as part of their mourning period. It was a way to keep their loved ones close. So the point of this is to show that these people were not a very far leap away from trying to like talk to the dead. Like they were already doing some very interesting things when it comes to mourning and the afterlife. And so when the Civil War breaks out, that really makes an impact on the way that these people live. It shakes their world up. As a matter of fact, if you look at the Civil War compared with World War II in terms of numbers and like population, the Civil War was actually more impactful for the United States in terms of casualties. Obviously that again is adjusted for population. And so I think this quote from Drew Gilpin Faust kind of sums it up, and her book is called This Republic of Suffering. For those Americans who lived in and through the Civil War, the texture of the experience was the presence of death. So these people are surrounded by death all the time. So before the Civil War, the idea of a good death for these people is if somebody would get sick, you know, they would be aware of it, they would hold a vigil, kind of wait for this person to pass away. The bodies were then undertaken in the home, the wakes would be held, could be the multi-day affairs, and then the bodies were eventually, you know, taken care of and then taken to family cemeteries or close cemeteries. And then the Civil War comes along and completely shakes up that entire routine. Thousands of enlisted men just die in battle and are buried in the municipalities where they fall. If you were here for Paige Jennings' lecture last week, they were simply buried in places in cemeteries marked Confederate or Union dead. So a lot of people turn to spiritualism in this time as a way to get validation that their family's soul was at peace, because this idea is completely disrupted. They are no longer allowed to have this tradition because the Civil War completely breaks up the logistics of their burials. By the end of the war, an estimated 11 million people in the United States are subscribed to the idea of spiritualism, and around 35,000 practicing mediums are in the United States. In the South, it is not as common for people to have like separate seances. So in the North, it was a really big and popular thing for you to like have a separate seance. Like literally people were like, come over for tea or come over for lemonade. I guess it wouldn't be sweet tea in the North, but it would be like, come over for lemonade. And we'll have a seance and try to contact these people. Whereas in the South, it was actually more part of a church experience. Like you would go to church, and while you're having an experience, you would like be like, oh, I feel so and so around me. And it just became part of like the church experience to almost have these encounters with spirits. One thing I do want to point out is some subtle Southern spiritualism that we see even today that kind of goes outside the realm of the ideas of the seances and things like that. So how many of you have ever seen a porch painted with this kind of blue tone underneath? Yeah, okay. That's called haint blue. That's H-A-I-N-T, haint. And then these blue bottle trees right here. So both of these come from the Gullah tradition, and the Gullah people were brought over and enslaved here in the South, primarily in the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida, in those islands. And they have a belief in their tradition. I'll let this pass. They have a belief in their traditions that ghosts and spirits cannot cross water. So the idea is that ceiling blue or your door blue or your shutters blue, that the ghosts or the spirits will think that it's water and cannot cross. So that's where these traditions come from in the South. That was kind of taken in as part of our traditions and used here in the South. It's the same idea with these cobalt blue bottles. The idea is that the spirits will go into the bottles, get confused, and get stuck in the blue bottle and can't come out. So I think this quote from Smithsonian Magazine sums it up pretty well. And if you're wondering why I have this picture, this quote comes from an article that explains the invention of the Ouija board. So these boards were actually created in the 1800s and as a response to the rise of spiritualism in the United States. It started off doing table tapping. That is how people would communicate with these spirits during sessions. And so you would like tap on tables and get responses. And people became increasingly frustrated with how long it was taking to get responses. And so they invented these boards that had the alphabet on it and the yes, no, and the numbers so they could get their responses faster. But I think this quote does a really good job of summing up why spiritualism became so popular at this time period in the country. So spiritualism worked for Americans. It was compatible with Christian doctrine, meaning one could hold a seance on Saturday night and have no qualms about going to church the next day. It was an acceptable, even wholesome activity to contact spirits at seances through automatic writing or table-turning parties in which participants would place their hands on a small table and watch it begin, shake and rattle while they all declared that they weren't moving it. The movement also offered solace in an era when the average lifespan was less than 50, women died in childbirth, children died of disease, and men died in war. So, now we're going to kind of bring it home to our region and Appalachia. So spiritualism as a movement remained popular somewhat into the early 20th century, but what we recognize today as the mainstream Christian sort of establishment takes over as the popular religion of the United States during World War I and moving into World War II. And a lot of that happens, just because of the wars. We needed a lot of charity, fundraising, things like that. And obviously the people that are there and willing to provide that a lot of the times are church organizations. And so as they continue to grow through the wars, they move into the mainstream. Appalachia, however, is a bit of a different story. So Appalachian religion seems to be kind of stuck a little bit farther back than any other place in the country. It's called mountain religion, or comes to be known as mountain religion, and is much more reminiscent of what you would have seen at the turn of the 19th century during the Second Great Awakening. So, do you remember what I talked about during the Second Great Awakening that you would have seen? The circuit riders, the camp meeting, the big revivals. That's more what Appalachian religion looks like to the outside world, I'll say, to the rest of America. That's what's going on in Appalachia. There's aspects of Scots-Irish sacramental revivalism. That's just fancy talk for people are using. There's a revival of sacramental worship, meaning communion, baptism, those kinds of things are going on in Appalachia. Continental pietism, again, the idea that piety should be in there, that it should be part of your everyday life, should be part of your social outings, should be part of the decisions you make. And then Baptist revival culture, the idea that every now and again that you need a good revival in the church, those sort of things. I felt like a preacher when I did that. So, as a matter of fact, Appalachia is fiercely religious. These traditions are very much ingrained in Appalachia. It's Protestant pluralism. There's, Methodists and Holiness and Pentecostal and Baptists and Independent Baptists and Hardshell Baptists and Foot Washing Baptists, and there's a lot of Baptists. You get where I'm going with that. But those are the kind of churches that you're going to see in Appalachia. Well, it gets to the point that the rest of America seems to think that there is something wrong with Appalachia. And for a very long time in America, there has been this myth around the people who live starting here in the North Georgia mountains and all the way up into Virginia and into Pennsylvania in these mountains, that we're kind of strange people. And there's two different stereotypes. There's the stereotype that we should kind of be romanticized, that we're these rugged people who pioneer and live on our own, and it's a great place. And then there's the people who think, and y'all, this is like my favorite quote that I found when I was doing this lecture. Then there's the people who think that the people of the upland South were long known to Americans as peculiar people, given to inbreeding, moonshining, quilting, clogging, and feuding. Now, I'm not going to lie to y'all, I did clog from the time that I was 2 until the time that I was 17. I cannot deny all of this. But they started to call us things like backwards people. Now, I don't feel backwards. Do y'all feel backwards? So, they conducted these surveys to kind of assess where we were as a people. And the surveys completely ignored suburban areas like Asheville and Knoxville, where it was very clear that Appalachia had access to like modern conveniences. And they focused solely on very isolated areas. But even so, it reinforced this stereotype. And then in 1965, they founded the Commission on Religion of Appalachia, also known as CORA. I'd also like to point out that there was something going on in the 50s that kind of drove them to do this. Can anybody tell me what was going on in the 50s that might have drove them to be really concerned about economic development in the United States? I see Jordan. He's kind of chomping at the bit back there.
I was going to say the Cold War.
It is the Cold War. So if any of y'all were here for Amelia Golchewski's lecture a few months ago, she touched on this when she was talking about women's care labor. So in the 1950s, America was very concerned with America's image and how we looked on the world stage, because we were in this ideological war with the USSR and which ideology was going to win. You know, communism, capitalism, all of those things. And the rest of America in the 1950s was booming economically. Appalachia was not. And so part of this survey was trying to figure out what was going on with Appalachia, and could fixing Appalachian religion help that situation. So again, they found the Commission on Religion of Appalachia in 1965, and that commission had 3 goals. Solidify the church's role in Appalachia, help improve economic conditions in the area, and bring Appalachia up to date with the rest of the United States. So there were a few things going on with the churches of Appalachia that really brought great concern. There were some practices going on in these churches that these people thought were fundamentally strange. Things like, I heard a like a little giggle. Was that you, Dad? Things. We'll get to that. Things like foot washing kind of caused them concern, because this was not something that was going on necessarily in mainstream worship in the rest of the United States. Speaking in tongues, and everybody's favorite and probably the most controversial, snake handling. So they came into the Appalachian Mountains and saw people in mountain churches doing stuff like this and thought we had all lost the plot. And so they thought we needed evangelizing. They thought we needed to have a talking to. And if y'all are curious about that slide title, "They shall take up what?" that comes from a specific Bible verse. It's Mark 16:18, where it talks about they shall take up serpents, that they shall drink poison and not be harmed. So it comes from that. This is another photo from the Foxfire book. This man's name is Dexter, and apparently he was the snake keeper for this church. He was the one that handled them, brought them in every Sunday. Other practices that made their way, that were involved in Appalachian culture that didn't even necessarily have to do with church, that caused these people to think that we were all kind of spooky and kooky, included things like planting and harvesting and slaughtering by the signs. If you've lived here long enough, you've probably heard of some of these things, or maybe even had a grandparent or an aunt and uncle that did some of these things in their lives. Talking fire out of a burn or talking off a wart, using herb combinations to ward off illness and bad luck, sometimes even using Bible verses or things to help cure wounds and illnesses. And so the people saw this and thought, okay, we need to go have a talking to these people, because obviously they are not part of an actual religious tradition. I didn't mean to do that. So all of that to say, this stuff was passed down from generation to generation from when they first came to settle. A lot of this was old world stuff. A lot of it came from, obviously, from nature around them, and it makes sense when you think about the very isolated parts of Appalachia. Obviously, if you don't have access to a doctor to treat a burn or a wart, you're going to use what you have. Planting, harvesting, slaughtering by the signs. There's this quote here in this book, Pert Nigh Gone, that I think really kind of sums up this part of the lecture very well. It says, "Not only did the mountaineers believe in their remedies handed down from generation to generation, but they also believed in doing things by the signs, especially as it related to the moon. Homemade soap would not set if it were not made in the full of the moon. Shingles would curl if split or nailed down while the moon was growing. The ideal time to place them was when the points of the moon were turned down. Fence posts must be set in the old of the moon when its size was decreasing, otherwise they would loosen. This was also the time when crops must be harvested, or they would rot and not keep well. The opposite was true for killing hogs. This must be done when the moon size was increasing, or the bacon from that hog would shrink when fried, and the ideal time to set hens was 3 weeks before the full moon. A circle around the moon meant rain, and it was bad luck to see a new moon for the first time through the trees. In addition to the moon, mountaineers observed nature around them for signs of importance. Some would call such beliefs superstitions, and well they may be, but the question remained that if they didn't work with some regularity, why did they endure?" And so, all of this to say that Cora did go into the mountains in the 1960s and try to tell us a thing or two about religion. But obviously, these things endured and lived because they exist in the anthologies that we have here in places like the Bartow History Museum. And it's important to keep these things up because they obviously made an impact on America's religious history. And they continue to have an effect on us to this day. Some churches still do things like this. You can have hands laid on you when people are praying for you. And it's important because you're all in these seats tonight, right? You're supporting the Bartow History Museum and the kind of places that keep these anthologies and keep traditions like this preserved and alive. And that is kind of it. I'm really bad at wrapping things up. So yeah, I finished early, so if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. Yes.
What inspired you to do this research?
I'm so glad you asked that. This book right here. And this book came from the bookshelf of my parents' house. And it was my dad that kind of inspired this, and he's sitting right back there in the back row. Raise your hand, Scott. So one day, when I was about, I think, 8 or 9 years old, I pulled a tooth. And it was like one of my front teeth, and it kept bleeding and bleeding and bleeding. My gums bled for probably about 30 minutes, and we could not get it to stop. And finally, my dad pulls this book called Georgia Mountain Heritage off of the bookshelf in our dining room and says, "Come here." And he pulls out his Bible and he said, "Here, read this." And it was the verse Ezekiel 16:6, and he told me to read it 3 times and replace all the these and the thous with my name. I did. My mouth stopped bleeding. And I remember walking away from that, and he was like, "Did it stop?" And I was like, "Yeah." And I remember walking away from that encounter being like, "What kind of witchcraft did we just do in my living room?" And so I remember ever since then being kind of fascinated with this book. And that's kind of what inspired this.
So what is the book you're talking about?
This is it. It's called Georgia Mountain Heritage. It is a book of old mountain remedies, old sayings, and delicious recipes.
So how do you refer to it?
Well, this lives at my parents' house, so not as often as I would like to, but I have my own book now in my own home library that has stuff like this in it. I refer to it pretty often. Last year, I started making fire cider to start taking at the end of during this season when cold and flu is crazy. And my friend Sarah back there, she came over and she was like, "What are you doing?" Because I had a table full of onions and ginger and garlic and like every spice in me. She was like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "I'm making fire cider." And she was like, "What is fire cider?" And I was like, "I read about it in this old home remedy book. It's this thing it's got all these spices in it, and you're supposed to like take a shot of it every time you start to feel sick, or just like every day to give you an immunity boost, and like it tastes pretty good, honestly, and you can use it as a salad dressing." It says so pretty often, actually.
And who wrote that book?
It says Levi's CIT team, and I actually don't know. I actually don't know where this book came from. Mom, Dad, do you remember where this book came from?
From your mama's grandmother.
From my mama's grandmother.
Yeah. Greenway side.
The Greenway side. So it goes back a bit. I have no idea.
Oh, I got a question about the snakes.
Yes.
What? And how, you said every service where you get the snakes out? Is it after the choir goes down?
When the doors open.
So I can actually show y'all more pictures in this book because I have time to walk around.
When the doors open is when the snakes come out.
Yeah, so they brought them in every week, and from what I can tell, it has information on the snake handling itself, but so the idea of snake handling is if you've got the spirit, either the snake won't bite you, or if it does, it's not going to hurt you. And so in most of the pictures, it looks like there's a great deal of clapping and stomping and other things going on while the snakes are out. Now, I've always been told that if you see a snake, you're just kind of supposed to back away really slowly. So how these snakes didn't get freaked out during all this, I don't know. But there was also something going on in this church too, where these women and men would take like the camphor lamps. You can see it here. And like they would hold camphor lamps up to their hair and like to their feet, and supposedly they wouldn't be burned during the service. You can see them there. They're like holding the lit wicks up to their feet.
What about local snake handling churches?
Local snake handling churches?
That's still a thing?
Yes.
Do you know where there's one is?
Supposedly there is one in Kingston. Used to be one in Kingston.
There is one in
Allegedly, like that stuff is.
Allegedly.
They still have them every Sunday, but not one person takes care of all the snakes. All the people that attend church have their own snakes. As I was growing up,
I'm sorry, this is like a bring your own snake situation?
yeah, they got them at their home. As I was growing up, I do live at the foot of hills, and the Wades that live up on 61, they no longer have church there, but they would come out many a times and catch the rattlesnakes, the copperheads and everything, and they would bring milk jugs with them. And so they would hold those snakes up and they would start them at the tail and get them on down in that jug. And then if they got another one about the same time, they would go ahead and get him down in that jug too. Now I watched that happen many a times from a closed-in vehicle.
I think that's
So
probably wise.
Now I have went to a snake handling church because the best friend of mine, and I told her, because she always went to church with me, and I told her, I said, they start over there with me with those things, and I'm here to tell you, I'm out of there. I am out of there.
It's gonna be a
She said,
me-shaped.
they will not come over here with me. I play the piano, just sit behind me, and we'll be fine. And I thought, okay, I'm not sure you're telling me the truth, but I told her, I said, I'm telling you the truth now. I'm out that door. Because I already made sure I knew where the doors was. But they never came to our direction. But I can tell you, I don't know what the preacher preached on, and couldn't tell you the songs they sung, because I was watching those boxes that people brought in with their snakes. And they did bring them in boxes.
And like I said before, you know, I was kind of joking about the Baptists and how many different Baptists, like different Baptists there were in the mountains at that time. But I don't know the different situations that there were with the snake handling church, because there were several of them, I mean, throughout the mountains. But it's just this one particular church, the quote in the book was like, Dexter, the snakes were really his things. And like this is Dexter. And there's a photo in Foxfire of him carrying in several boxes of the snakes. And so he was just, I think, in this particular instance, designated to be this church's snake keeper. Any other questions
And I
about?
can tell you something even better. When I was working at the hospital, we had several, when the Church on the Mountain was very active, they would periodically bring people in that had been bitten. And one of the gentlemen they brought in was very grave ill. He was from Tennessee, and they decided that they needed to bring their snakes in to heal him, because no medicine would heal him. They had to call the law so that did not take place.
Because a lot of them, they don't necessarily believe in actually getting remedies for the snakes, because for the bite, because
Right.
the idea of it is that if you are really with the Lord and you really have,
You will not die.
you won't die. So
And the only time they would bring them in was when they were near death or just about there. But I can remember that occasion because a lot of the people kind of scattered there in the emergency room and had to have law to come in because they were dead serious. They were dead serious. But if you visit the church at Rome, in Kingston, Mr. Porter is buried there. And if you visit his tomb, you will see a snake on his tombstone, because he was a very, I don't want to say well-known handler, but he was very believed in that.
does anybody else have any questions about any?
Did Mr. Porter die of the snake
Yes, he did.
No.
bite? Oh,
Oop.
So now, does that mean he didn't have?
I don't
We
know.
can't speak to that.
I don't know.
But so that's a terrible way to find out you ain't right with God, though.
Can't speak to it.
All right.
I'm not going to see if my faith is strong enough, I can tell you that. But I've also experienced of going somewhere for fire to be taught down my hands, because a gentleman that lived up, like I say, we lived in the mountains. I could tell you a lot of stuff about a lot of that stuff.
Trey's afraid to hear it.
So I guess that I'm one of those old-fashioned people. My family and his family grew up with that, and still do, affected by the signs and all.
Well, this is my favorite. Is one of my. I don't know if my granny got it from this book or not, if she came up with it on her own. But my mom will attest to this. Every New Year's, my grandma will call us and be like, "Now remember, don't wash clothes today. Don't wash clothes today." And I kid you not, in here on page 57, it says, "If you wash clothes on New Year's Day, someone you love will die."
Well, we were closed last New Year's. Why didn't you?
So don't wash clothes on New Year's. And if you need a reminder, I'll tell Juanita Nation to put you on her list.
Let's just be safe not to either. But you're talking about your trip being full. Used to people would go by that. And go by the signs. And almanacs now are not as popular, but I used to always like the old-timey farmer's almanac that you could get at the Feed and Seeds for free. But I understand now that the gentleman that brought those has deceased during COVID, and so they don't have them. I don't enjoy the ones you can buy, because they're not as, I just like the old ones. But yeah.
And so y'all don't think I'm crazy. Here are all my sources for this. There you go. All right.
I'm glad to see you have Paul Harvey as a source. That was the rest of the story.
Oh, yeah.
Lauren, thank you. That was very interesting, very insightful, and yes, let's get away from the snake talk.
Trey does lots of things.
Lauren will tell you that she made an offhanded comment to me a couple months ago about, I have this great interest in X subject. I said, great, you can do a talk on it. And here she was. She did a great talk. Let's give her another hand. Thank you for coming out this evening. The museum is open. You're welcome to take a look around the upstairs in the exhibits or our temporary exhibit. Don't forget the announcements I gave at the beginning, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.